It's the 3rd of May, 2019. This is the RheumNow podcast, brought to you by RheumNow.live, the meeting that will never go away. I'm Dr. Jack Cush, executive editor of RheumNow.com. This week in the news, 3 big questions that will be answered by today's report. First, what's new with the FDA? Second, what drug has the highest dropout rate in psoriatic arthritis? That's a good one. And lastly, which disease has the greatest degree of non-adherence and at what cost? So at the top of the news, we have 2 new FDA approvals. First, the FDA has announced the approval of a new biosimilar from Samsung Bioepis. It's the etanercept version that they've produced. In other countries, it was called Benapali and had another name that not Brenzis. But now it's approved in the United States. It is etanercept, it is approved. No, you won't see it in the United States for a long time to come because of Enbrel's patent protection and legal wranglings and whatnot. But this is now, the 5th or 6th or 7th? I think it's the 6th or 7th biosimilar approved in the United States. And while biosimilars are doing some good business worldwide, $1 billion or so, in the United States they're not doing very much. They are creeping in. I saw one of my infusion reports the other day. Patient was on Inflectra, meaning it was substituted for Remicade without my knowledge or consent. And this is one of the many problems that I think still exist with biosimilars in the United States. But there's still a lot of issues that are being worked out, and most of that's being done in the courts. The second big announcement is Benlysta has been approved for childhood and pediatric lupus. They've done one very large trial. It was the Pluto trial. Not so large, 80 patients, good enough to get actually by the FDA. As you know, their other trials were very large in phase 3 in adult lupus. And in this study, they took patients on background therapy, treated them with 10 milligrams per kilogram of belimumab or placebo. The results were presented at ACR meeting showing that belimumab in pediatric SLE is safe and effective. The SRI-4 responses are a lot like the adults, maybe a little bit better, meaning 52%, 53% belimumab responses versus a 43 or 44% placebo response, enough to get it approved. The question again is, who should get it? Under what circumstances? Where is it going to work best? Those studies, I think, should be done. Rheumatoid arthritis. One of the big advances in rheumatoid arthritis care has been new therapies. And new therapies have really come a long way since 1998 when actually leflunomide was approved. That was 3 years after cyclosporin was approved. And also in 1998, we had the introduction of etanercept, soon after followed by infliximab. And since then, the results and the studies have been many. The results have been interesting. I think that the biologic era brought on a lot of new concepts in treatment that have benefited patients greatly. But if you notice a few things in the last few years, placebo rates are really high. It used to be said, arthritis drugs, 20% placebo rate. Now we see placebo rates that are quite commonly over 30, 35%. That means that, again, for true drug effect, you're looking for that delta between the placebo rate and the drug under study, the investigational agent results. So, you'd like to see 30+% or more to when a drug gets FDA approved. That's one of my problems with some of the belimumab trials. The margin of difference between belimumab and placebo wasn't great. It was less than 10%, but it was enough in a high number of patients, the drug got approved. In RA, it's, 20 can get a drug approved. 30 is usually what we're seeing. Seldom do you see 50. But one of the interesting things that we reported on was the issue of placebo responses. It turns out that analysis of registration trials, this is done by a group in Ireland, they looked at the placebo responses from 1998 to 2018, major drugs, major trials, TNF inhibitors, tocilizumab, all those. And they showed that the placebo response rates have significantly increased over time, and that it was significant for ACR placebo responses, ACR 50 placebo responses and ACR 70 placebo responses. And at the same time, there were significant reductions in the profile of patients with a shorter disease duration, fewer swollen joints getting in, and DAS-ESR values were actually lower. So the question is, why are we seeing this trend in higher placebo responses? I think that, patients who are more experienced on multiple therapies, there's an expectation bias. The question has also arisen whether rheumatoid arthritis is changing over time and actually getting harder to treat, whether there's a problem with the clinical trials changing over time, which clearly has happened as well. But it's an interesting phenomenon. Placebo response rates have also gone up over time. An important study comes from Tom Taguchi and colleagues that looked at denosumab in RA patients, specifically looking at whether giving this rank ligand inhibitor would affect X-ray outcomes in RA patients. The study is called the DESIRABLE study. It's 654 patients with about 2 years disease duration. 85% were on methotrexate. They all had active disease going in, and they were either on top of their usual therapy, not biologics, but were given denosumab either every 3 months or denosumab every 6 months, or a placebo group. And what they found was sort of interesting. Those that are on denosumab, either the Q3 or Q6 month group, actually had significant reductions in erosion scores over a 12-month period, I think is the primary endpoint here. Over a 12-month period, no change in cartilage or joint space narrowing scores. Total sharp scores did get better, but not always significant, but it was the erosion scores that was significant. At the same time, bone mineral density scores also increased. What didn't increase? What didn't change? That's right, ACR 50, 20, 70. I don't know why I transposed those, but just to keep you awake, ACR 20, 50, 70 did not change. So the clinical parameters went unchanged by using denosumab. But the X-ray outcomes, progression in RA, did change. So I wouldn't use denosumab instead of a biologic, where we know TNF inhibitors are very, very effective at this. I think this is sort of adjunctive. If you have patients who need osteoporosis therapy, you can get a double bang for your buck by adding in denosumab as opposed to another, maybe anabolic agent. An interesting study comes from France, where they looked at new drug starts in psoriatic arthritis patients who are either apremilast naive or methotrexate naive. They weren't entirely DMARD naive, but for patients who started apremilast and patients who started methotrexate, what was going to happen to these patients? There's a large number of patients, 3,200 started apremilast and 2,700 started methotrexate. They found that the discontinuation rate at 1 year was 69% for apremilast and 59% for methotrexate. So what can you say about this? Number one, it kind of reaffirms my belief that methotrexate is not very effective in psoriatic arthritis, but this is at odds with the recent PSA SEAM study, which was etanercept versus methotrexate versus the combination in psoriatic arthritis, showing that a high percentage of patients responded to methotrexate alone. But that was in a clinical trial. This is real world experience, and real world experiences in 1 year, 60% have dropped out. And that's actually a lot more than what you see with RA, as you know. But even higher is the dropout rate on apremilast. I'm not surprised here. Apremilast is a good drug, it's a safe drug, but again, it may be limited by its toxicity. It also is limited by its low margin of efficacy. 40% ACR 20 response rates is about what you see in patients going on apremilast. So it's great that it's safe, it's great that it's first line, but it's also not surprising that it has a higher dropout rate, mainly because of the GI side effects and the lack of efficacy. Interesting study looked at what happens in patients as far as their methotrexate and LFTs. I think this is a good perspective piece. It's a prospective study of 213 RA patients starting methotrexate, and they looked at what happens to their LFTs. And actually, it was really quite impressive. They had like over almost 6,000, 7,000 liver tests, and they found that after 4.3 years, only 7% had an ALT elevation that led to a discontinuation. 21% had an ALT elevation at any time that was greater than 1.5 times the upper limit of normal. So the strongest predictor of liver enzymes going up while using methotrexate were patients who had elevated liver enzymes, ALT, at the start of therapy. Only a very few, 3%, permanently stopped methotrexate due to an ALT elevation. So I think this is something we need to continue to monitor, but we don't see a whole lot of this problem. A study of almost 15,000 patients with autoimmune disease from a UK clinical practice database looked at the use of influenza vaccination amongst their arthritis and autoimmune patients and showed no evidence that influenza vaccination actually results in an arthritis flare or an increase in doctor visits, PCP visits, for arthritis flares. I think this is important data, especially as you try to talk to patients about why they may not want to take an influenza shot. I found an interesting study about ANCA-associated vasculitis and uncommon manifestations. And I bring that up because I heard a case last week at one of the conferences about ANCA-negative ANCA vasculitis, and I really thought that's got to be uncommon. But in this particular study, 8 out of 171 ANCA-associated vasculitis patients were looked at. Turns out they were all PR3 positive. They tended to be either very young, I think it was 6 out of the 8, or very old, 2 out of the 8, and then very old, 6 out of the 8. And the most common manifestation was actually pancreatitis. They also had a few with unusual pulmonary manifestations such as cystic lung disease or UIP pneumonitis, and lastly 2 cases with splenic infarcts. Unusual manifestations of ANCA-associated vasculitis. So we had a nice study that comes from the pain literature that looked at the cost of giving therapy and the non-adherence cost in patients with many of our diseases. Specifically, they looked at patients who have either osteoarthritis, gout, diabetic polyneuropathy, postherpetic neuralgia, and fibromyalgia. So it turns out, which of these do you think had the greatest degree of adherence? Conversely, which of those had the least amount of non-adherence? The greatest degree of adherence was seen in osteoarthritis, 51%. In gout, it was 25% adherence. Not surprising. We know gout patients are horribly non-compliant. 59.5 for diabetic polyneuropathy. That's almost 60%. 55% with postherpetic neuralgia were adherent, and 33% for fibromyalgia. So those of you who would have guessed fibromyalgia was the most non-adherent, you're wrong. It's actually gout, 25%. Fibromyalgia is following up close behind. More interestingly, they looked at the cost of care with healthcare utilization, and they compared those that were non-adherent to those who were adherent. Turns out whatever the price of adherence was, let's say for one study, I think it was for OA, it was like $5,000. The non-adherent, the cost was like $9,000. So either there's a 50 to 100% doubling of the cost of care. So that's one of the consequences of non-adherence. This is one of our major problems in medicine that we need to find a better way. I think it has a lot to do with how we communicate and trust. So an interesting study looked at how often we achieve our targets in gout, specifically the target of an SUA of less than 6.0. But if you had very severe gout, that would be an SUA of less than 5.0. Severe gout in this study was defined as patients with multiple attacks and who had pain and whatnot. Actually, they also looked at patients who were in remission. And remission was SUA less than 6 or 5, who had no pain, no flares, had a pain of 2 or less, and no longer had any tophi. In this particular study, they showed that somewhere between 50 and 70% of patients were actually able to achieve at some point the target goal of an SUA less than 6. But if you look at the plot, it looks like about 40% of patients overall achieved a target SUA. If your goal was an SUA target of less than 6 and remission, well, actually that was really quite uncommon, because remission was seen in 9% at 1 year, 30% at 2 years, 28% at 3 years, and 28% at 5 years, meaning remission is uncommon in gout, and it was never achieved in patients who had severe gout. Not surprising, since resolution of tophi would be one of the definitions there. So it turns out that our patients seldom achieve a target and remission with gout. And this is a sort of data that's been out there before. There are a lot of studies that looked at achieving the target of 6 or less, and it's really 27 to like 45%. It's really quite low, and really the best data comes from not you, the rheumatologist, but when you have gout clinics run by protocol by nurses, advanced practice providers, and or pharmacists who have a protocol and multiple frequent visits, they have amazing achievements. They get to target by 90% of their patients. They achieve remission in far greater than 60%. So again, we need changes in how we manage our gout. Lastly, there was a report from the ACR and the Arthritis Foundation about the management of juvenile idiopathic arthritis, especially those with polyarthritis, and also the management of uveitis and monitoring of uveitis. Two different reports put out, and it's in ACNR right now. The highlights on this is do not use steroids in kids. Not surprising. You can use steroids as bridge therapy, but steroids are not a part of the regimen in kids. Methotrexate is recommended over other DMARDs as initial therapy. They recommend using subcutaneous methotrexate, parenteral methotrexate, as compared to oral. And then because of the high risk of uveitis, they recommend ophthalmologic screening every 3 months in people at risk. And then they go through the steps of whether you use topical drops versus systemic, and then when you would institute the use of a biologic in someone who has refractory uveitis. That's it for this week. Go to rheumnow.live and register and look at our 30 lectures that are really astounding, short form, great discussions, fabulous speakers. It's free. See you next week.